Okay, Tov, today's daf is daf Zion, and we're learning all the svekos of Rav Papa regarding Yadayim. So we're up to the top line on the Amud Yesh Yad with Staka, O Ein Yad with Staka. If a person designates Ma'os for Staka, but he uses a language that's not complete with the Staka Bichal. Hechi Dami, the Gemara asks, what's the case? If he points to one particular pot of money and he says, Hadain Zuzo Tztaka, this money should be for Tztaka. And then he looks at another pot of money and he says, Hadain Nami, and this too. Once he adds the word Nami, Hahu Tztaka Atzmahi, that's not a case of Yadayim. That's an outright, straightforward case of Nidre Tztaka. Because Nami means that this also should be tzedakah. Ella, but what's the case that Rav Papa vacillated about? Kigon v'omar hadein v'lo omar Nami. He did not add the word regard to the second zuz, Nami. My. Hadein Nami tzedakah kamar. We're not sure if he means that the second zuz should also be designated as tzedakah. Dilma, perhaps, he didn't have in mind that the second zuz would be with stock. He left out the word nami, and therefore, although we are pretty sure that he meant that this also should be tzedakah, however, there is a possibility that my v'hadain, what was the meaning, his intention when he added the word v'hadain, le nafkusa bi'alma kamar. He just wants to use that second zuz for the expenses of his house, and he doesn't want it to be Staka. You'll say that he should have added the words, this second zuz I want to leave for myself for my expenses. The Bura Hudiliaske, he didn't finish speaking, and therefore the tzedakah should not be chal on the second zuz. It remains chulin mos chulin. And this Gemara that we see here on Daf Zion is almost an exact parallel to the Gemara that we saw yesterday on Daf Vav Amud Beis with regard to Peah, where he looks at one aruga and he designates it as Peah. Then he looks at the second nearby aruga and he says Vehadain. And we're not sure what he meant by the word Vehadain. Did he mean this too? And he left out the Nami. He should have said Vehadain Nami. Or did he mean that Vehadain, that this second aruga should be for his own purposes and his own ownership and should not be designated as payer? The Gemara continues and analyzes the two tzdadim in Rav Papa's dilemma. The Torah says, Motza sfasecha tishmar biasisa. And then it says, Kasher nadarta Hashem Elokecha nidava, asher dibarta b'ficha. A person has to observe and fulfill that which he uttered in his lips. And this pasuk is telling us, Bal tiacher, that he's not allowed to delay the fulfillment of his personal commitment through motzas vasayim. And the pasuk is explicit about neder and nidava. It says kasher nadarta l'Hashem Elokecha nidava, and then it says beficha. And the Chazal in Masechet Rosh Hashanah derive from the word beficha zut tzedakah. It's a reference to tzedakah. So we have a hekesh in the pasuk between Nedarim nidavos, which are karbanos, and tzedakah. And that hekesh will teach me Baal Tiacher. So now we want to question the scope of that hekesh. Since there's a hekesh in this pasuk between stock and karbanos d'chsiv, beficha, and we use the word beficha to interpret it as zutstaka. Therefore, ma karbanos yesh lam yad, af tzedakah yesh la yad. Shall we expand the scope of this package to include even the halacha of yad? Oh, Dilma, maybe you should take a more narrowly defined interpretation of the application of this hekesh and lebalti acher de iskish. The hekesh here is regard to what is the explicit subject of this pasuk, namely the balti acher. But there's no hekesh beyond the confines of balti acher. So we don't have a hekesh from which we can establish that just like there's a din of yad in karbanos, so too there's a parallel din in yad with staka. And even though we have a principle called ein hekesh lemechza, but ein hekesh lemechza doesn't apply here because the Torah doesn't mention staka explicitly. It's only a drasha that the word beficha alludes to staka. And in such a case, we have a more limited hekesh. Now the Rashba adds the following. When we analyze and understand the suffix of a papa with regard to staka, and this is on the footsteps, on the, immediately following the suffix that was exactly parallel of a papa with regard to peah, we should add the words im timtze loma to these sfekos, meaning, if you're going to tell me lamaskana the yesh yad lepeah, then we want to know whether or not that halach of yad, which applies to peah, should be extended and applied to tzedakah as well. Maybe peah, we're more machmir, that a person is chayav in the mitzvah peah, whether he likes it or not, and therefore the Torah was machmir and upgraded a yad to a full-fledged commitment for peah. But in the case of tzedakah, we still have a suffix. Why? Because a person decides on his own voluntarily to give tzedakah. He's not absolutely obligated to say that this is tzedakah. And therefore, perhaps the Torah would be more lenient and would say that if he didn't say it explicitly with a lashon gvura, then it's not chal and there's no chiyuv tzedakah. So this is the Rashba's imtim tzaloma. Now Rav Papa goes on with another suffix. Yesh yad lehefker, or dilma ein yad lehefker. A person says this object should be hefker, ownerless, and then he adds with regard to another object, vizeh, but he left out the word nami. So the Gemara asks, hainu tzedakah, why should Rav Papa bother with a new suffix with regard to hefker? There doesn't seem to be any nuance of a difference between the suffix that he had with regard to tzedakah and the suffix that he's raising now with regard to hefker. And basically, hainu tzedakah, hefker is tzedakah. Why? When a person is mafkir his mammon, what motivates a person to say that this is ownerless when he puts out, let's say, a basket full of fruits and he puts it in front of his house and he says, it's a hefker, why would he do such a thing? The answer is he wants the aniyim to come by and pick up the odorless fruits, which are hefker. So what motivates a person to be mafkir something is that he wants to supply the aniyim with those fruits. That's tzedakah. So what's the difference between the suffix of a pup with regard to yad l'tzedakah and the suffix that he's now raising with regard to yad l'hefker? And the Gemara now says what we saw earlier in the Rashba, but now the Gemara is outspoken about it. Imtim tzaloma kama, imtim tzaloma yesh yad l'tzedakah. On that side, that if you come to the conclusion that yesh yad l'tzedakah and the hekesh between tzedakah and karbonos is ein hekesh lemechta, it's not a partial hekesh, but when we expand the scope of the hekesh to include not just bal tiacher, but even yodos. And even though it doesn't say explicitly in this pasuk a smichus between karbonos and tzedakah, it's only a drasha that beficha zu tzedakah. Nevertheless, we should still apply the principle of ein hekesh lemechta. This hefker mi'amrinon, in the case of hefker, should we say that hefker hainu tzedakah? It's exactly identical to tzedakah as the Gemara argued logically previously, and therefore yesh yad lehefker. Dilma shiny tzedakah, hefker, and tzedakah are different, one from the other. Why? The tzedakah lo chazia el lanim. When a person decides to designate a zuz as tzedakah, only the aniyim are allowed to take that tzedakah. It's a hefker only for one segment of the population. And it's a limited kind of hefker. Aval hefker, if a person declares something hefker, bein lani and bein lashirin, even a person who's not an ani is allowed to come and be zocha in that hefker because he declared it as hefker. He didn't call it staka. So it's not identical to staka, and it's not included in that hekesh. The only reason why we conclude, according to this intim tzalom, that staka is included under the halach of Yadayim is because of its equation to korbanos. But hefker is not staka. And since hefker is not staka, it's not included in the hekesh to korbanos, and we don't know how to conclude about the din of Yadayim. Now, eventually what we want to do is, in the list this whole string of cases that Rav Papa vacillates about, what do we do halacha l'maisa? But before we get into that, let's finish the entire series of Sveikos of Rav Papa. Then we'll come back and analyze what do we do la halacha when the Gemara comes to no apparent, definite conclusion whether there is a yad or there's not a yad. And now we're going to get into a sugya called hazmana. Hazmana means that when you designate a place for a certain purpose, that designation is chal, and that location takes on the law, the dinim, and the status of that designation. For example, in a Beis HaKisei, you point to a place and you say, I'm designating this as a bathroom. And there's no tzoa there right now. In fact, it's possible that he never even used it, even on one single occasion for hotzas tzoa, but nevertheless he designated it as a Beis HaKnesses. Now, as a Beis HaKisei. Now, the law and the status of Beis HaKisei is that you're not allowed to read Torah or Tefillah or Kriyat Shema. You're not allowed to even think Divrei Torah in a Beis HaKisei. And this is all derived from a pasuk in Parshas Ki Teitzei V'hoya Machanecha Kadosh. Boy, Ravina vacillated. Yesh Yad Beis HaKnesses or lo. In other words, when a person designated clearly, and it was very explicit that this is a Beis HaKnesses, the assumption that underlies Ravina is that Hazmana Milsa, that when he designates it, it takes on the halacha and the status of Beis HaKisei, and it's also for Kriyat Shema and Tefillah, even though there's no tzoa there. Just the very Chal Hashem Beis HaKnesses, which is generated by his Hazmana. But what happens if he uses an unclear language? What was unclear? If you're telling me it's a case, and this is what Ravina had about the Yoma. Hadein Beisa Lehevi Beis HaKisei Vadein Nami. So he designated one house as a bathroom, and then he points to another place, another room, and he says this also. Hahu Beis HaKisei Nami Hava. That's an explicit case where he added the word Nami, and there's no question about his intention and his dibur that it has the mashmos of that this second bayis should also likewise be a Beis HaKisei. Ella, but rather, what's the question that Ravina vacillated about? Kigon di Omar v'hadein v'lo Omar Nami. Again, this is parallel to the sugis that we saw earlier with regard to Peah, with regard to Tzedakah, with regard to Hefker. What's the din? Hadein di Omar v'hadein Nami. He really meant to say that this second bayis should also be designated as a Beis HaKisei, and apparently he needs more room. His family is expanding, and therefore he needs more room for using as a bathroom. And therefore, Beis HaKisei, certainly it would also be a Beis HaKisei. Odillah, but perhaps his dibur is not gomer, because we could possibly reinterpret the word vadein, my vadein, l'tashmisha v'alma kamer. He leaves the second bayis for his own personal usages, whatever he needs it for, and therefore he doesn't want it to be a Beis HaKisei. So in this case, we have a suffix whether or not yesh yad leBeis HaKisei. The Gemara asks the following question: Vichlal the pshita leRavina yesh zima leBeis HaKisei. The entire presentation here of Ravina is predicated on the premise that if a person designates a place as a Beis HaKisei, he's never actually used it, even on one occasion, as a Beis HaKisei. It's already asur b'kriyat Shema and davar sheb'kedusha. So the Gemara asks, Ravina himself had a doubt about his minul beis hakisei ma'u. Is there hazmana milsa? Does the halacha recognize the validity of hazmana when you designate something, even though it hasn't been used as such before? Ma'u, is it valid? His minul beis hamerchatz, or for example, he designates a place as a bathhouse, which again is also the davar shebekdusha. You can't be mahar in divrei Torah in a bathhouse because of the pasuk vayamachanecha kadosh. Ma'u, what's the din? Zimun moel or ein zimul moel? Ravina vacillates on the issue of whether azmana milsa, and it generates the status of the place and the surim that are resultant of this place, and that's the issue of whether azmana milsa or azmana lav milsa. So you see, the Ravina wasn't sure about it. So why is he asking here about yad based on the hazmana? Maybe the hazmana itself, even had it been explicit, would not be valid and would not generate an isur of Torah and Dvar Shem Kedusha. And the Gemara answers, Ravina chadami go chadami boile. Really, Ravina has two different speikos. And what we saw here is only one of two. Number one, the first suffix that komi boile is zimun moil or ein zimun moil. What's the status of zimun? Does zimun have the halachic power to generate isurim and change the status of the place? And imtim salomar, here's where Ravina adds the suffix of yad. It's a piggyback suffix. Imtim salomar yesh zimun. If we'll come to the conclusion that when a person makes a verbal designation, that is valid to generate the status of that place and therefore generate an isur of davar shebekdusha, then I'm going to ask you, yesh yad o ein yad. Supposing the zimun itself was an incomplete zimun, he said v'hadein, but he did not add the word nami, tiboile, and the Gemara comes to the conclusion that, like the previous speikos with regard to peah and staka and hefker, this issue of yesh yad lebeis hakisei remains an outstanding question. Lo pashtu bebeis hamedrash, they didn't come to any conclusion in the beis hamedrash. It's teku, as we have teku b'kol mokum. So now let's take a little bit of a break before we go on in the sugya and ask la halacha, what are we going to do in all these cases? So let's go back to the original case. That was the original, the real McCoy suffix of a papa. And that was the case of Kedushin, where he turns to Rachel, he gives her Kesef Kedushin, then he turns and he gives her two prutos, and then he turns to Leah and he says Vi'at. He doesn't say Vi'at Nami, but Vi'at. And we were vacillating back and forth whether or not, based on the assumption that he meant that Leah should also be married to him, and the second pruta that he gave to Rachel, he was appointing Rachel as a shliach on behalf of Leah. Leah accepted the Kedushin. Is that a valid Kedushin? Or should we say that, no, Vi'at Chazor? He meant to say, you watch what's going on, and then tomorrow, hopefully you'll agree to marry me. So in this case, we have to paskin based on the principle of Safek D'Oraisa L'Chumra. We have to treat her, meaning Leah, as an Ashes Ish. But what about the case of Peah? What about the case of Tzedakah? The Rif and the Ramban and others say that here too we go L'Chumra. We have to apply the principle of Safek Isura L'Chumra because Peah is a Chiyuv D'Oraisa and so is Tzedakah. And the Ran doesn't understand what's going on here. We're talking in the cases of Peah and Tzedakah about a Safek Mama. Do the Aniyim have rights to claim and demand payment to collect the Peah that's Tzedakah? And here we have a principle called Safek Mamona L'Kula. Hamotzi Mechaber L'Varaya, since we don't have we leave it as an outstanding question, and therefore the Aniyim have to prove that the halach is such. And until they do so, which they cannot do so, then they're out. You know, the burden of proof is on them. So it seems that there's a fundamental machlokas here about how to define Peah and Tzedakah. Do we classify Peah and Tzedakah as Isur v'Heter, and therefore Safek L'Chumra, or do we define Peah and Tzedakah as Safek Mamon? However, in the case of Hefker, that would seem clearly to be a case of Safek Mama. And therefore, even the Rif and the Ramban, V'seyosam, would also agree that in the case of Hefker, we're going to apply the principle of Safek Mamona Lakula, Hamotzi Mechaber of Haraya, and if there's doubts as to whether or not he actually made it Hefker, everybody, all the Rishonim would agree in that case as Lina Lakula, V'eno Hefker. And finally, in the case of Beis HaKisei, the Meiri says, Yesh lahakir. We're going to be mekil in Beis HaKisei. And the Rashba before him and the Ran also, they all agree there's something about Yad with Beis HaKisei. We're going to pass him l'kul. Why? I mean, we're dealing with a Safek Iser of Dvarim Kedusha. Says the Meiri that we have a Sfex Vekir. First of all, we don't know if Hazmana Milsa, and Ravina never came to a definite conclusion about that suffix. And on top of that, you have another suffix, even if Hazmana Milsa is the Yad Lebeis HaKisei. And in Sfex Vekir, we go L'Kula. The Rashba gives another explanation, and he says that we're going to say Ein Yad Lebeis HaKisei L'Halacha. Why? Because Zimun itself is only rabbinic. Even if we conclude that Yesh Hazmana with regard to Beis HaKisei, that's only midrabanan. It's not halacha d'oraisa, and therefore something d'rabbanan l'kul. Now we go on, and we go back to our Mishnah. The Mishnah records a machlokas between the Chachamim and Rabbi Akiva about the lashon menuda ani lecha. The Chachamim hold that that's a lashon nidui, and it's not a lashon neder. Therefore, it's not awesome. Rabbi Akiva Yechochef Lazalahachmir, he was in doubt about it, and he therefore was machmir because he felt that menuda is also a lashon of neder. Amar Abaye, Moder Rabbi Akiva le'inyan malka sheino loka. Rabbi Akiva didn't say that he was definite that this is a lashon neder. If a man violated that word of menuda ani lecha, he would not give malchus for such a violation because Rabbi Akiva was only machmir mitzad safek. Came because if you're going to tell me that Rabbi Akiva holds you get malchus for violating menuda ani lecha in Mishnah, the Mishnah should have said Rabbi Akiva machmir. Period. He's machmir l'dina, and he considers it like an eder gomor, and therefore you get malchus. Why does the Mishnah use the language hayachochech lahachmir? You know, his mouth was moving in this way. He was nervous. He wanted to be machmir. It doesn't say that he was machmir. It was only chochech lahachmir. And therefore, he didn't come to a definite conclusion. His ruling was only a safek. Now the Gemara wants to know what exactly is the case, which is the subject of the machlokas between the Chachamim and Rabbi Akiva. Amar Rav Papa. Let's clear the shetach here, the area. Be medina minach. If he uses the word Medina, then Kuli Amalo Pligi Diosir, even the Chacham would agree that the language of Medina is clearly a language of Neder. Because the word Medina in its root is from the word Nun Dalid Nad. Nad means I'm going to move away from you. It's as if he said, Meruchak ani mimcha, I want to separate myself from you. Sheni ochilch, I won't eat from your food. And that's clearly a case of neder, and that lashon fits into the general category of yadayim l'nedarim, which was mentioned earlier in our Mishnah, like Wudrani, Mufrashni, Muruchakni, and there the Chacham agree, Yesh Yad l'nedarim. Now we're going to have the other extreme, a case where everybody agrees that he's not using a language of neder, and that's where he declares mishamtana minoch. Mishamtana is miloshin shamda, which is the Aramaic equivalent of nidu. Is l'kuliyal mashari. Everybody, even Rabbi Akiva, would agree in this case that it's not a lashon neder; it's only lashon nidu. In other words, he wasn't motzi mipim lashon neder; he's a neder, and therefore it's mutter. Again, exactly what the laws of nidui are, we'll see in on Omid Beit. So now that according to Rav Papa, we've cleared the path. The Dina is a Lashon Nad, Umaruchak, and even the Chacham agree it's also, it's Neder. The Shamtana is a Lashon Shamta, and even Rabbi Akiva agrees it's not a Lashon Neder, it's Mut V'mai Pligi. So what exactly is the scenario upon which there was a division, a machlokes between the Chachamim and Rabbi Akiva?